Fellas, the UFC can't afford to let 2025 go to waste. 2025 has potential to be the biggest year the UFC have had yet. If we look at UFC in 2025 so far, we've had two kind of lackluster main events because of the poor opponent quality that the champions are facing. But I feel like every UFC pay-per-view could be a banger this year, and the UFC could have its biggest year yet. What we don't need this year are title fights like Dricus versus Strickland, Jones versus Stipe, or just a fight between a champion and a contender that no one's really intrigued to see and nobody really asked for. So I'm going to be showing you that the rest of the year in 2025, if the UFC play their cards right, could be a banging year for the UFC. My overall philosophy is that every card must contain at least 2 title fights or at least a banging co-main event to make up for the fact that there's only going to be 1 title fight. If we look back at 2024, we had 4 2-title fight cards, all of which were women MMA co-main events. We didn't have a single champion versus champion fight, and we didn't even have really any super fights apart from maybe Topuria versus Volkanovski and Topuria versus Holloway, even though we did have obviously UFC 300 in the Sophia to make up for it. But yeah, I'm going to be showing you that the UFC can afford to make every pay-per-view, or at least every card for the rest of this year, a banging year with some massive super fights to be made. This isn't going to be a card builder. I'm going to be making a lot of assumptions, and I'm not going to be taking into account pullouts, which could potentially affect fights being made, but assuming that the UFC make the card right, we've already had the first 3 cards of 2025 announced. So for UFC 314, there's no main event, there's no co-main event, and we don't really know who's going to be headlining this card. It's going to be Miami. If we look at all the potential champions who could headline this card, I've erased Merab, Islam, Dricus, and Porton because they're going to be fighting soon. I'm also going to erase Jones and Balal because I don't think they're going to be ready. So Ilia Topuria versus Alexander Volkanovski to headline UFC 314 is a massive main event for UFC 314. I mean, I know there's Diego Lopez and Movsar Evloev that some people want to see headline this card, but I think Volkanovski in a rematch with Topuria is by far the bigger fight. Volkanovski is the former featherweight champion. He only lost it once to Topuria, and before that he was dominating the featherweight division, looked pretty much unstoppable, cemented himself as one of the greatest featherweights of all time. I think he's definitely earned his immediate rematch, and he's at this stage in his career where he's either got to go big or go home. If he's going to win again, I want to see him win a belt. I want to see him become a champion again. I want to see that gold wrapped around his waist in a massive moment, and if he loses again, I want him to lose to the best in the world. I don't want him to get knocked out by a contender. I don't want him to get 50-45'd by Movsar Evloev. If he's going to lose again, I want it to be against Topuria, the best in the world. So I feel like Volkanovski's in a position where he's got to go big or go home. This fight has a storyline around it. It's a very big fight. Topuria Volkanovski to headline UFC 314. That's a big main event. And then to make the card even more stacked, banging co-main event, another title fight. Alejandro Pantoja taking on Kai Kara France. You've got Kai Kara France from New Zealand and Volkanovski from Australia, so you've kind of got that area of the world backing them. Kai Kara France just knocked out Steve Erceg, taking on Pantoja, who's the defending unstoppable flyweight champion. This is a massive fight. I think Kai Kara France is like the only reasonable contender for Pantoja. Another big fight that you can stick on UFC 314, and already, that's a massive card already. Volkan Kai Kara France taking on Topuria and Pantoja, 2 defending champions versus 2 intriguing contenders and a former champion. That's a stacked card for UFC 314, and that's just the main and the co-main event, showing that if the UFC played their cards right, we can have a sick card in Miami. And then for UFC 315, this is going to be in Canada. There's no fights announced yet, but it is going to be in Canada. So if we look at the champions who could headline this card, it's between Balal and Jones. Jones ain't going to be ready, so Balal Muhammad versus Shavkat Rakhmonov for the main event of UFC 315. I know people are going to be complaining because Balal Muhammad's on a card, but he's the champion now, and he's the defending and the dominant champion. You know, we just dominated Leon Edwards for 25 minutes straight, just like he has been doing to every other contender, taking on Shavkat Rakhmonov, who's without a doubt the #1 contender, and he's probably the most intriguing contender for Balal Muhammad right now. They're both on absolute tears in the UFC. They're both on these huge winning streaks, and I think that's a much better title fight in the welterweight division compared to the recent welterweight title fights we've been having recently, because people have been asking for this fight. People have been waiting for Shavkat to get his title fight for a while. Finally got it on the main event in Canada at UFC 315, and then again you can fit another title fight on this card with Valentina Shevchenko versus Manon Fiorot. I know this isn't like a mega fight for a co-main event, but you've got Shevchenko, who's one of the greatest flyweights in women MMA, cemented a legacy, dominated the division, eventually lost to Alexa Grasso, but picked up that win recently at UFC 306, and now she's taking on Manon Fiorot, who's the only real contender, who's on a huge winning streak in the UFC, ranked #1, beat Blankfield, beat Nama Younes, so you've seen Shevchenko take on the next contender in Manon Fiorot, who some people think is going to win, and again, that's another solid card. I know it's not a mega card with 2 massive fights, but 2 title title fights. Belal Muhammad taking on Shavkat, the most intriguing contender. Shevchenko taking on the #1 contender, Emmanuel Fiorot, for Canada as well, who usually gets served garbage. That's a pretty good card for Canada as well. And then for UFC 316, if you look at the potential champions who could headline this card, I think Merab, Makhachev, and Jones would be available. So Islam Makhachev versus Arman Tsarukyan, do that for 316. Or if you want to see him face Charles Oliveira, you do Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira as well. Makhachev should be ready. I know he fought at 311, but he took no damage in that fight. It was done and dusted pretty quickly. So I think you can do a quick turnaround for Makhachev. 316, him versus Tsarukyan makes a lot of sense because obviously this was scheduled for UFC 311. Tsarukyan never lost, he just pulled out. And he's still the #1 contender. You know, he beat Charles Oliveira. It's the best wrestler versus the best wrestler in the division. Two guys with pretty good stand-up as well. I've already told you the whole narrative of this fight, and everyone's already seen the narrative leading up to 311, but that could be rescheduled for this card. Or we could see Charles Oliveira get another title shot, which I'm not mad at because he had a very close fight with Tsarukyan. He just dominated Michael Chandler, where he actually looked like he'd improved his wrestling tenfold. So Makhachev versus Oliveira, Makhachev versus Tsarukyan. Either way, let him headline 316. There's no excuse this time around. He's not fighting a featherweight for people to make an excuse against. He's not fighting a rusty contender. And if, you know, God forbid someone pulls out in the main event of this card, have Beneil Dariush as the backup. And even though Dariush isn't a top contender, he's probably a tougher fight for Makhachev than somebody like a Moicano. So you've got a safe, obviously back up there. And then for the co-main event, another title fight: Juliana Pena versus Kayla Harrison for the women's bantamweight belt. And even though the women's bantamweight division is cursed, I think that's a much better title fight than the recent title fights we've been having in the bantamweight division anyway. I don't mind Pena versus Harrison. They've been calling each other out multiple times. They've got this massive rivalry that they've kind of been building up to each other at press conferences. And Kayla Harrison, she's like the Michael Chandler of women MMA. She's got this judo Olympic gold medal background, 18 in women MMA, dominated Holly Holm in her debut and beat Ketlin Vieira at UFC 307 against Juliana Pena, who beat Amanda Nunes, beat Pennington for the belt, two-time champion. I think this fight has a lot of narratives too. I don't mind Pena versus Harrison, and at least they're going to build the fight. They've already been trash talking at fights at press conferences where they ain't even facing each other, so they'd build the fight, they'd sell the fight. I think Kayla Harrison is a really intriguing contender. For 316, Makhachev versus Tsarukyan or Oliveira, Pena versus Harrison. Again, another banging card for 316. Two fairly decent title fights on the card. That's a decent main and co-main event too. And then for UFC 317, this is going to be International Fight Week. Now, I did do a card builder a few days ago for this, and I think if you look at all the champions who could headline this card, John Jones versus Tom Aspinall, this is the perfect card to put this fight on, and this is a super fight. This is like the first real super fight we would have had of 2025. I mean, it's the biggest fight you can possibly have. If Dana White wants massive fights, this is the one to make. I don't need to explain it to you. Jones versus Aspinall is the fight of 2025. Even if we see like Topuria versus Makhachev and all these big fights, if we don't see John Jones, arguably the greatest of all time, take on the #1 contender and by far his biggest test in Aspinall, who's the interim champion, the defending interim champion, I'm going to be disappointed with this year. It's the biggest fight of 2025. It's the biggest fight in heavyweight MMA history as well. John Jones versus Tom Aspinall to headline UFC 317. Super fight written all over it. The fight everybody wants to see. The most hyped up fight in MMA right now. Have that for 317. And then for the co-main event, have like a Dustin Poirier versus Max Holloway. Technically still for a belt if you do it for the BMF belt, but either way, that's a banging co-main event. That was my philosophy. If it's not for a title fight, it's got to be banging, and I think this is one of the best fights you can do. Two of some of the best boxers in the UFC. Dustin Poirier is one of the sharpest boxers in the UFC. Max Holloway is one of the sharpest boxers in the UFC. Last time he fought at 155, he KO'd Justin Gaethje. So Poirier versus Holloway for potentially Dustin Poirier's retirement fight. You couldn't write it any better. For the co-main event of UFC 317, and again, that's a stacked card. And then for UFC 318, the potential champions who could headline this card could be Merab, Dricus du Plessis, and obviously Poatan. I think we do another super fight. Dricus du Plessis versus Khamzat Chimaev in the main event. This is probably the biggest title fight, at least the biggest champion versus contender fight you can do in the UFC. Apart from John Jones versus Tom Aspinall, you've got Dricus du Plessis, who, I mean, the guy's finished Robert Whittaker, beat Strickland on 2 different occasions with the second one being more decisive, submitted Israel Adesanya, and he's on this massive winning streak in MMA where he looks like he just can't lose no matter how hard people try. Taking on Khamzat Chimaev, who has just dominated everybody in the UFC. No, maybe hasn't dominated everybody, but had a dominant start to his MMA career and kind of pulled his socks back up in his recent fight. took down Robert Whittaker and smashed him to pieces. So Dricus du Plessis versus Khamzat Chimaev, massive main event. Dricus is going to win by plot armor. Chimaev's going to win by mauling. It's one of the biggest fights you can do in the UFC right now. One of the most intriguing fights you can do in the UFC right now. For the main event of 318, Dricus, Chimaev, and again, we've got to stick another title fight on us. Let's have Merab take on Petian in a co-main event of this card. Merab's a star now in the UFC. After that fight with Umar Nurmagomedov and how good he performed in that fight, kind of not embarrassing Umar, but showing that how dominant Merab is as a champion, and with a lot of the wins he's been getting recently, he's a star. But if you look at the bantamweight division, there isn't really a #1 contender. Most people are coming off a loss, apart from Petian, who's coming off 2 wins. I know he's dominated Petian before, but Petian's the only real contender. So Merab versus Petian for a co-main event of UFC 318. I mean, if Merab's in a co-main event nowadays, you know it's going to be a good card as well, considering that he's been in some massive fights before and he's performing in all of them. This could even be in Abu Dhabi, where Khamzat Chimaev doesn't have any traveling problems, and you can have 2 Russians headlining and co-main event in an Abu Dhabi card. So I think UFC 318, Dricus versus Chimaev, Merab versus Petian. That's another banging card there for UFC 318. A massive stacked fight card that you could potentially do in Abu Dhabi. And then for UFC 319, the only real champion that will be able to fight is Alex Pereira. But I'm going to be saving Poatan for a bigger fight later on. So I'm not actually going to include Poatan. So this is going to be the first card that doesn't contain a single title fight. And I think there's a perfect guy that we can bring back for UFC 319. I know there's going to be people complaining, but let's try for McGregor. Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. I know there's a 99% chance he doesn't come back. I literally made an entire video about this 2 weeks ago, about how McGregor's never going to fight again. But if there was a card, there was a time slot where we could potentially fit a Conor McGregor to come back on, it is going to be against Michael Chandler in UFC 319. I've chosen Chandler because, I mean, it just probably makes the most sense. They've got a rivalry. Chandler's not going to decline the fight. It's an easy main event you can just give to Conor McGregor. Not easy in the sense that he's going to win, but easy in the sense that it's easily promotable. People have seen the promotion for this fight already. So if we are going to see McGregor come back, UFC 319 when no champions are available is probably the only time we could do it. And then for the co-main event, just do like a Yuri Prochazka versus Carlos Ulberg. You've got former champion Yuri Prochazka against maybe the winner of Jan Blachowicz and Carlos Ulberg at UFC London. For a co-main event of this card, I think that makes sense. I don't want to see Yuri back in there immediately because he has been knocked out by Alex Pereira. I know he just beat Jamal Hill in dominant fashion, but I think he's going to get that one big win. And I think either a Carlos Ulberg or a Jan Blachowicz, whoever wins that fight, in a massive co-main event for the #1 contender fight for the light heavyweight division, Yuri versus a winner of Ulberg and Blachowicz for the co-main event of a McGregor card, I think makes a lot of sense, and it will be a banger of a fight. And then for UFC 320, there's a few champions that could headline this card. Like I said before, we've got Poatan, now we've got Belal, Topuria, and Pantoja. I think you do Belal Muhammad versus the next welterweight contender, and I think Jack Della Maddalena could be a good fight for Belal Muhammad. Belal Muhammad versus JDM, or Shavkat. If Shavkat beats Belal, you could do Shavkat versus JDM for the welterweight belt, but either way, the welterweight belt on the line for UFC 320. We've obviously got JDM taking on Leon Edwards at UFC London. I'm assuming that JDM's going to win this fight. Obviously, if he doesn't, then this fight can't take place and it's going to have to be someone else. But just Belal Muhammad or whoever the welterweight champion is taking on a contender. You've got JDM, who's one of the best boxers in the UFC right now. Had some impressive wins. Actually has some underrated grappling, in my opinion. Taking on one of the more dominant champions in the UFC right now in Belal. We're not going to see Belal go up and face a Dricus du Plessis. I know I've been making a lot of champion versus champion matchups, but we're not going to see him do some dumb shit. Just a simple contender fight. Belal Muhammad or Shavkat taking on the #1 contender in the welterweight division, I think makes a lot of sense. And then for the co-main event, we're going to have the biggest fight in women MMA we've had in a while. Valentina Shevchenko taking on Zhang Weili. Again, there's a lot of assumptions being made. This is assuming that Shevchenko beats Manon Fiorot, but this fight has to happen. Shevchenko versus Weili. Pound for pound #1 versus pound for pound #2. Shevchenko, who's literally unbeatable in the flyweight division, at least it seems, against the most dominant women MMA fighter of this era in Zhang Weili. Zhang Weili's been dominating everybody. She looks like she just can't lose no matter who you put her against. Against Shevchenko, who, like I said before, is one of the greatest flyweights of all time. And after beating Grasso a third time, I don't really see anybody beating Shevchenko. This would be one of the biggest women MMA fights ever. And it's a co-main event as well. It's not even like a main event. It's a co-main event of a pay-per-view. UFC 320. I think that's a stacked card. Belal versus JDM or whoever the welterweight champion is. Shevchenko versus Weili. Stacked card, including a super fight. And then for UFC 321, you've still got multiple champions that could potentially headline this card. I think you do Islam Makhachev versus Ilia Topuria. This is probably the biggest fight. I know I've said this multiple times now, but this is kind of like a fight that's getting talked about a lot, and it would without a doubt be one of the biggest fights in UFC history. I mean, you've got two mega stars with Ilia Topuria and Islam Makhachev, two massive stars who look unstoppable in both of their weight classes. There's been rumors of these guys taking each other on. I'm not going to rush them against each other just yet, but you've got Islam Makhachev, who's a huge star, looks unbeatable. Ilia Topuria, who's a huge star, looks unbeatable. If Topuria can knock out Alexander Volkanovski to win the belt, defend against Max Holloway, and then maybe beat Alexander Volkanovski again, I don't mind this fight. Again, I know, like I said, we've got Topuria and we've got Diego Lopez and Movsar Evloev. Put them in like a #1 contender fight, maybe like an interim title fight to determine who fights for the belt next. And in the meantime, Makhachev versus Topuria. I don't want this to be rushed too soon. Like I said before, I don't want this to be rushed too soon immediately, because I think there's still work for them to do in their division. But we have to see this fight eventually this year. This is a mega fight. This is one of the biggest fights you could put in the world of MMA. And it's one of the most intriguing fights because they both just look unstoppable. Makhachev looks unbeatable at 155. Topuria looks unbeatable at 145. I would bet money that neither of them ever lose in their own divisions. You have to make this fight. We can't go without seeing this fight. It's the biggest fight right now in MMA, in my opinion. Islam Makhachev versus Ilia Topuria for UFC 321. The super fight of the year outside of Jones and Aspinall. And for the co-main event, maybe like an Arman Tsarukyan versus Justin Gaethje makes sense. Or a Charles Oliveira versus Justin Gaethje. Or a Arman Tsarukyan versus Dan Hooker. Or Charles Oliveira versus Dan Hooker. What I basically want to see is whoever faces Makhachev for the belt early this year and loses against Makhachev can face the winner of Dan Hooker and Justin Gaethje. I think that would make sense. Let's say, for example, it's Arman Tsarukyan versus Justin Gaethje. That's a great card. Islam Makhachev, Ilia Topuria, and you can potentially do the winner of that fight versus the winner of the co-main event in Tsarukyan and Gaethje or whoever it is. And listen, Gaethje versus Hooker, is it a banger? Yeah, it's a banger of fight. It's violence personified. But it shouldn't be a title eliminator fight, in my opinion, because does anyone really want to see maybe like a Makhachev versus Hooker or a Makhachev versus Gaethje? I don't want to see it. I want to see them, at least prove themselves against a top contender because they get mauled by Makhachev. So, for example, Tsarukyan versus Gaethje to come in event this card, I think would make a lot of sense. And then for UFC 322, we've got a few champions that could headline this card. I think we do another super fight, another champ versus champ fight. Merab Dvalishvili taking on Alejandro Pantoja for the bantamweight belt. And this is because Pantoja, there's no one left for him in the flyweight division. There's genuinely no one left. Look at the rankings. There isn't a single name left for him. I know we've got Manel Kape, and he's going to be fighting soon. I think, who's he taking on again? Is it Azu Almabayev he's taking on? But we've got Manel Kape fighting soon, and we've got the likes of Moreno versus Usyk, but he's beating everybody already. He's cleared out the division. There's no one left for Pantoja. He looks unstoppable. And I think he's more deserving of a double champ fight than any other champion in the UFC right now because of the body of work that he's done in the flyweight division against Merab, who, like we said before, there isn't really a #1 contender in the bantamweight division. It isn't like Merab's holding up the division. If anything, he's given the division enough time to move. Merab Dvalishvili versus Pantoja, a fight that in my opinion isn't getting talked about enough, but would be a massive fight between two, again, similar to the Topuria Makhachev situation, two kind of unstoppable champions right now. Merab Pantoja in the main event. And then for the co-main event, we can have Kayla Harrison defend her belt against maybe like a Norma Dumont. If the best goes to best, Kayla Harrison beats Juliana Pena, defends against a #1 contender at the time, who I think will be Norma Dumont. So maybe just do the women's bantamweight belt on the line in the co-main event. But that's another great fight for UFC 322. And then for UFC 323, you've got 3 potential champions for the last card of 2025. Tom Aspinall versus Alex Pereira, or John Jones versus Alex Pereira for another massive fight in the heavyweight division. Now, obviously, Tom Aspinall versus John Jones is the fight that we want to see. We want to see this more than anything in the heavyweight division. But I think the winner of this fight should go on and fight Alex Pereira. There's been rumors, there's been a bit of flirting back and forth between both of these guys and Porton about a potential super fight. And obviously, we've got to see Porton get past Ankalaev first. If Ankalaev beats Porton, this goes straight out the window. That's another assumption that I've made. But if he can't beat Ankalaev, he's cleared out the light heavyweight division. There's nobody left for him. And if Tom Aspinall does beat Jones, there's no one in the heavyweight division. It's literally a division full of bland contenders who have lost to most of the top guys already and are win-loss fighters. Tom Aspinall versus Alex Pereira or Jones versus Alex Pereira for the main event would be probably the biggest super fight outside of Tom Aspinall. Could even be bigger than Tom Aspinall and John Jones, depending on the promo and how the fight between Aspinall and Jones goes. So if this is how 2025 goes, 2025 will be the UFC's biggest year. It will be the UFC's best year, and it will be the UFC 300 equivalent of years, is the best way I can kind of describe it. Massive fights that are being made, the fights that we want to see, mega fights, fights that are going to put the UFC on the mainstream, and just the best fights to see as fans. The reality is, though, we're probably going to see the champion face the #1 contender. The contender's probably going to pull out. We're going to have these big pullouts and these terrible guys step in. Dana White's going to refuse to make a big fight that everybody wants to see. We're going to see 2 exciting champions or a bunch of exciting champions lose the belt prematurely to people that we didn't really want to see them lose against. McGregor's never going to come back. I don't even know why I made him on this card. But if we just count the super fights on this card, there's numerous super fights, not the card, but the year. There are numerous super fights going on in 2025. Like, this isn't just a one big fight or 2 big fights. This is multiple fights on a consistent basis. There are so many super fights that the UFC can put on in 2025 between either 2 champions or just big fights in general. I know there's going to be that one dude complaining saying that champ versus champ matchups ruin the UFC. They hold up the divisions. But what about every champion versus contender matchup that I've just gone over? There's still plenty of champion versus contender matchups. It's not like we're holding up every weight class forcing champions to face each other. And would you really want to see a Dan Hooker versus Islam Makhachev over a Topuria versus a Makhachev, or a Tom Aspinall versus Cyril Gane, or a Tom Aspinall versus Alex Pereira, or a Pantoja taking on Moreno for a 4th time, over Pantoja getting a chance to face Merab? I don't think you would. So multiple super fights that can take place in 2025 if the UFC plays the cards right. Like, it's getting to the point where the worst main event this year is going to be Merab versus Shafkat, theoretically, if this was to go down. And that's not even a bad fight. That's an intriguing fight in the welterweight division. So yeah, I just think that this year so far with Makhachev and Moicano and Dricus versus Strickland, these are the fights that we don't really need to be seeing, because the UFC, they're doing great with fight nights. Like, we had UFC Saudi Arabia a couple of weeks ago, which was a great fight night. Cejudo versus Song at UFC Seattle, this is an amazing fight night as well. We've got up and coming. We've also got UFC London. We've also got UFC Mexico as well. But I think for 2025, we need to be seeing these big fights, and I hope the UFC don't mess up and they don't fail to get these big fights through. I think there's tons of super fights in every weight class that the UFC have been building up in 2024 to take place in 2025. And just look at the roster of champions we've got now. So dominant. Every champion we've got now is dominant. So that's just my thoughts on the UFC right now. They can't afford to let 2025 go. I've just proven that every single card this year can be a banging co-main and a banging main event. So let me know your thoughts on this, if you agree with my points made in this video or if you disagree. And thank you for watching.